Chapter 2 of Methodical Realism is the longest chapter in the book. It is as long as any two other chapters put together. This video will deal just with the first 15 pages. Gilson's main goal in this chapter is to contrast his view, which he calls methodical realism, with two other views out there in French neo-scholastic neo-Thomism of his time, the Mediate Realism of Mercier and the Immediate Realism of Mercier's student Noel. His goal is to show that both of these alternatives are unacceptable, and then he will present his own alternative in more detail. It's important to remember that all three of these views are, or claim to be, types of neo-scholastic realism. The issue here is not the critical problem, the critique of knowledge, which all three thinkers reject. The question then is, on what grounds do certain neo-scholastics maintain that the outside world exists? Gilson writes, "It is their reasons for affirming this, and their ways of affirming it, and only that, which I am going to explain." Now, Mercier's system depends upon two intellectual steps. First, establishing that the object of the intelligible forms is materially contained in the sensible forms, and second, to establish that the object of these sensible forms is in fact real. Gilson admits the first premise, the first inference, as non-controversial for him. For Mercier's system, then, everything will depend upon the second move. Can he prove that the sensible forms are real? Is there any means of establishing with certainty that a non-mental reality exists? To prove this, says Gilson, any neo-scholastic realist has two premises to work from, a principle and a fact of experience. The principle is the principle of causality, and the experience is the inner experience of the givenness of the object and subject in acts of perception. And note, regarding this last, what matters is not the truth of that givenness, but the fact that we have the experience of the givenness. Gilson proceeds to analyze this inner experience and notes two key points about it. First, the experience essentially involves an impression of passivity, meaning our sense impressions happen to us. They are events, and we receive them seemingly from outside. The second point is that these impressions are contingent. Because sense impressions come and go, their existence cannot be necessary. Therefore, their existence also depends upon something other than themselves. And this is why we are going to need the principle of causality to ground them, to provide a sufficient reason for the existence of these sense impressions. At this stage, then, there are two possible hypotheses available to Mercier. Either my sense impressions are caused by me, or my sense impressions are caused by something other than me, and since I've ruled out the idea that these sensations are self-causing, these are the only two options. We must reject the first option, however, because it conflicts with the passivity of sensations, which we previously observed. Therefore, goes Mercier's proof, my sensations are caused by something outside of me, which is the extramental world, QED. Now, Gilson begins his analysis of this proof by noting that this is, in fact, mediate realism. It begins with internal experience, then applies the principle of causality to that experience in order to reason out a proof of the existence of the extramental world. The reason we tag it as mediate is because it places something in between the mental experience of the subject and the existence of the reality experienced, and that something in between is the proof. Throughout this chapter, Gilson is also engaging with Noel's rival reading of Mercier. Noel argues that Mercier's system is immediate rather than mediate, and Gilson goes on at great length to insist that Mercier's text does not support Noel's reading of it. Gilson says, "Our sense perceptions give us the phenomenon of knowledge in which the sensory and the sensing subject are united in act. Our abstract concepts give us the phenomenon of consciousness in which the intelligible and the intellect are united in act." Now, if these ontological identities were not given, then there would be no point to epistemology. And if these ontological identities were also given as epistemological identities, then there would be no need to prove the external world's existence. And yet Mercier insists that we must prove it. He says that we require reasoning and not mere intuition to grasp the existence of the external world. Gilson also notes that Noel explicitly rejects the use of the principle of causality in proving the external world, and since Mercier's proof requires this principle, Gilson says, evidently, Mercier and Noel do not have the same position. The next 5 pages, Gilson spends doing a close reading of Descartes with some extensive quotes from several of the meditations. Descartes, he says, requires sensation in order to prove the external world. Ideas cannot be enough for such proof, and this is because our concepts are, as it were, existentially neutral. The concept of a non-existing thing is identical to the concept of an existing thing. Sensation, he says, always carries with it the inner and irresistible feeling that its object exists. And this is why the first step in Mercier's proof is the sensory intuition that posits along with it the object's reality. Mercier and Descartes both recognize the passive nature of sensation, and both use the principle of causality to establish the existence of the external world. Gilson notes along the way that his reading of Descartes is a rejection of a standard view of Descartes, which holds that he relies upon God's truthfulness to ground the existence of the external world. In concluding this part, Descartes notes that Mercier is not himself a Cartesian, but his proof follows similar steps to Descartes' proof. It starts with the same inner experience as its starting point and appeals to the same principle of causality in moving from that starting point to the conclusion that the external world can be known with certainty to exist. Since Descartes is certainly not an immediate realist, it follows, therefore, by this separate argument that Mercier should not be considered an immediate realist either, that Noel is wrong and Mercier is instead a mediate realist. This brings us to page 40 and the end of this first section of Chapter 2. I'll talk about the rest of Chapter 2 in another video.